If you've ever gone through the motions of a full life and still felt like none of it truly needed you, like the work would carry on exactly the same whether you showed up or not, this story is for you. It's about two brothers, a stretch of land, and a question neither one of them says out loud. The answer isn't the one you'd expect. Here's where it begins. There was a stretch of fence in Oakridge County that ran crooked for no reason anyone alive could give, cutting an angle across 60 feet of pasture that should have run straight and never had. Every other fence on the Hale place ran true, post to post, the way fences were supposed to run. Only that one bent, deliberately it seemed, though nobody could say why anymore. Walter Hale walked past it most mornings without slowing, coffee in one hand, boots dark with dew, headed toward water troughs that never seemed to need checking. He'd passed it so many times he no longer really looked at it. But even he couldn't have explained, if someone had stopped him and asked, why that one crooked corner was the only patch of real green left on the place by the end of July. The mornings that summer started the same way. The screen door, the dog not moving from the porch step, too hot to bother. The gravel driveway, ticking as the truck engine cooled from the night before. The smell of diesel and cut hay hanging in the still air until the first breeze finally moved it along. Somewhere down the fence line, a mourning dove kept up its low, steady call, the same three notes over and over, the kind of sound a person stopped hearing after enough summers of it. Walter checked the troughs first, then the fence line, then the herd, in that order every day, whether anyone asked him to or not. Nobody ever had. It was simply the order things happened in, the way water finds the lowest point without needing to be told. By late June, the rest of the pasture told a different story. Grass thinned and wide, uneven patches, brown showing through like scalp under thinning hair. The heat that summer had settled in early and stayed, the kind of dry heat that cracked the county road by 9 in the morning and didn't let up until well past dark. The radio in the kitchen mentioned it every evening between songs, a heat advisory, then another, until nobody bothered listening for specifics anymore. Cattle moved slower across the open ground, heads low, working harder for less. Dust rose behind them and hung there, unwilling to settle. Robert Hale, older by 3 years and taller by an inch, had expanded the grazing land that spring, clearing 8 more acres along the north line and running the whole herd across it at once, the way the extension bulletin he'd read recommended. He'd read that bulletin twice, underlined parts of it, left it on the kitchen table for a week like it was still deciding something. It had felt at the time like the kind of decision their father would have made, bold and visible, something a person could point to and say, that's what he did that year, rather than the slower, quieter arithmetic their father had also done and rarely mentioned. Every evening, Robert walked the fields with a clipboard, counting, recalculating, certain the numbers would catch up to the plan if he just gave them enough time. He believed in giving things enough time, as long as the thing in question was a plan he'd made himself. Walter walked the same fields behind him most days, saying little, noticing more than he said. He noticed which sections of new ground the cattle avoided in the heat of the afternoon. He noticed the shade line moving an hour earlier than it used to, now that half the windbreak trees along the north edge had been cut for the expansion. He noticed and said nothing because saying something had rarely changed anything before. Nobody had asked Walter what he thought of the expansion. He hadn't offered it either. That was simply how the two of them had worked since their father died 3 years back and left the day-to-day decisions, by nobody's clear vote, to whichever brother spoke first at breakfast. Robert usually spoke first. He had since they were boys, since long before there was a farm to decide anything about it all. By the second week of July, the herd had lost enough condition that the vet mentioned it without being asked, running a hand along a heifer's ribs at the annual check and saying only that she'd want watching, and that a few of the others would too. He wrote the visit up quickly, the way he always did, and mentioned on his way out that the whole county seemed thinner this year, that he'd said the same thing at 3 other places already that week. Robert answered by ordering more feed before he'd finished his coffee the next morning, standing at the kitchen counter with the phone cord stretched taut across the room, moving through the decision the way he moved through most of them, quickly and mostly alone. The price per bag had gone up twice since spring. He wrote on the back of an envelope and didn't say the number out loud. Walter mentioned it once, standing near the gate with his hands in his pockets, the truck door still open behind Robert. He said the old corner by the crooked fence had never failed, not in all the summers he could remember, not even the drought year their father used to talk about at Sunday dinner. The one where half the county had trucked in water, and their father had claimed, more than once, that the Hale place had come through it better than most for reasons he'd never fully explained. Only that his own father had known something about that fence line the rest of them had stopped bothering to ask him about. Walter had always half assumed it was one of his father's stretch stories, the kind that grew a little each time it got told. Robert didn't look up from the feed order spread flat across the truck hood, the pencil already moving down a column of numbers. He said they didn't have time for old stories, and went back to the figures in front of him. Nothing more was said between them that morning. The screen door of the feed store swung shut somewhere down the road, and a truck passed on the county highway, and that was the whole sound of it ending. He never brought it up again after that. The next day, before Robert was awake, Walter moved a dozen head onto the unused ground near the crooked corner just to see. He didn't tell anyone. He worked the gate slowly so the hinge wouldn't wake the house, walked the small herd across dew-heavy grass in the gray hour before sunup, and stood at the fence afterward watching them settle in. The way a person watches something they aren't sure they had any right to try. Nobody noticed the cattle had shifted. Nobody noticed, 3 days later, when he moved them back, that they'd come in heavier at the main gate than when they'd left, either. He wrote nothing down. He said nothing at dinner, where Robert talked mostly about feed prices and a neighbor's new baler, and whether the county might finally repave the stretch past the old grain elevator. Walter had started to notice these last few years how much of what he did on the place passed unremarked, present and then gone, the way weather does. Some mornings, walking the fence line alone with the gate creaking behind him and the dog trailing a few steps back, he wondered whether the farm would run exactly the same without him standing in it all. He wondered at the way a person wonders about a toothache, pushing on it now and then just to check if it still hurt. It wasn't that he wanted credit exactly or thought he deserved a different life than the one he had. It was closer to a small, persistent doubt that had nothing to prove itself wrong and nothing to prove itself right either. Just sat there most mornings while he worked, quiet company he'd gotten used to without ever quite making peace with. That Thursday, looking for a missing bridle in the tack room, he found something else instead. Behind a stack of old halters, wrapped in a feed sack gone stiff with dust, sat a canvas-bound notebook, its cover water-stained, its corners soft from handling, the kind of object that had clearly been picked up and set down thousands of times by someone who never once thought of it as important. The writing inside was his grandfather's, small and even, unchanged from the first page to the last. Elias Hale had kept it for 11 years, one line at a time, describing a rotation built around the exact odd angle of that one crooked fence. He'd shaped the line that way on purpose, the notebook explained, splitting the ground into sections timed to rest and graze in sequence, each one given its turn and then left alone long enough to recover before the cattle came back through. There were small sketches in the margins, a rough map of the fence angles, arrows showing which section came after which, the pencil lines gone soft and gray with age. But the notebook wasn't only instructions. Season after season, in the same plain hand, Elias had written a short line before nearly every entry. Move the herd. Today. Corners still holding. Sometimes just the date and nothing else beneath it. Once, after what must have been a hard summer, judging by the ink pressed harder into the page, he'd only written, still holding, thank God. Further along, the handwriting loosened a little, the letters running slightly downhill, the way handwriting does when the hand doing it has gotten older without the person noticing. One of the last entries, dated a spring Walter remembered only vaguely, read, showed the boy the gate today. Didn't say much. Might have listened anyway. No explanation anywhere on any of the pages. No pride in any of it. Just a record of a thing done quietly, on schedule, for years, by a man who never seemed to expect anyone would read it. Walter sat on an overturned bucket in the tack room for a long while, the light through the small window shifting slightly as a cloud passed, reading the same page twice, then a third time. He counted the entries without meaning to. 11 years. Somewhere past 400 lines, each one nearly identical to the one before it. And each one, he realized slowly, a decision made all over again on a day when it would have been just as easy not to bother. Reading it pulled up a memory Walter hadn't reached for in years. He'd been 9, trailing his grandfather along that same crooked fence on a morning nearly as hot as this one. The wire hot enough to sting bare skin, grasshoppers scattering ahead of their boots through grass gone brittle at the tips. He complained about having to move the cattle again so soon after the last time, said the section looked fine to him already, didn't see the point. Elias hadn't answered right away. He'd finished latching the gate, wiped his hands slowly on his trousers, and said that people always thought they knew a field's condition by looking at it once. Then he'd said, almost to himself, that someday the old ways of doing this would sound like nothing but stories to somebody, and that would be fine, as long as somebody kept doing them anyway. Walter hadn't understood either sentence at 9 years old, hadn't thought about them again in the 20 years since, and hadn't expected them to come. Back to him now, sitting on an overturned bucket with dust in his throat and his grandfather's handwriting spread open across his knees. The healthy corner hadn't survived by luck. It had survived because someone kept showing up for it, long after there was any obvious reason left to think it mattered. The next morning, before Robert was up, Walter began moving fence sections by hand along the unused field, matching the pattern in the notebook as closely as he could work it out from the sketches. The wire was stiff with age and bit into his palms. He worked slowly, checking the angle twice against the crooked corner, and by the time the sun cleared the tree line, his shirt was soaked through, and he had one full section reset. He told no one. He expected nothing to come of it. It was, he realized somewhere in that first quiet hour of work, exactly the way his grandfather never had either. There's a kind of work that never gets thanked, because it never gets seen, the small maintenance of things nobody remembers needed maintaining. A fence kept at the right angle. A field rested on schedule. A person showing up, morning after morning, for a job with no audience and no applause waiting at the end of it. Most of what keeps a place alive isn't the decision anyone remembers making. It's the years of small, unrecorded repetition that come after the decision, carried by someone willing to be forgotten while doing it. What happens to all the quiet work a person does that no one else ever notices? Does it disappear the moment they stop, or does it simply wait, the way a field waits for someone to finally look? Walter didn't know the answer yet. He only knew the corner was still holding, and that he intended to keep it that way, whether his brother noticed or not. Over the following weeks, the test field answered the way the old corner always had. Grass came back, even, thick at the roots, holding moisture longer between the rains that were growing less frequent by the day. The color of it was different from the rest of the pasture, a deeper green that stood out plainly from the road if anyone had thought to look, though nobody driving past that summer did. Walter checked. In most evenings after the main chores were done, kneeling to press his palm flat against the soil the way the notebook described, feeling for the cool dampness an inch below the dry crust on top. More than once that first week, standing in the kitchen with Robert close enough to hear, Walter came near to saying something about the notebook, about the test field, about the whole quiet arrangement he'd built without asking anyone. Each time, something stopped him before the words got past the first sentence. Not fear exactly, more the sense that saying it out loud might turn it into something that could be argued with, weighed, decided on by committee, when right now it belonged only to him and to a dead man's handwriting, and he wasn't ready yet to hand any part of it over. So he said something else instead, about the weather usually, and Robert nodded and went back to his own list of worries, and the moment passed the way most of Walter's moments did, unremarked and gone. He kept a private rhythm to it that nobody else knew existed. Tuesdays and Fridays he moved the small test herd through the next section, always before 6, always alone, the gate hinge worn quiet by then from so much careful opening. Some mornings it took 20 minutes. Some mornings, when a post had shifted or a wire had slipped its staple overnight, it took closer to an hour, and he'd be late starting the regular chores, and Robert would ask, without much curiosity, where he'd been. "Fixing fence," Walter would say, which was true enough not to feel like a lie. He said nothing to Robert about the rest of it, partly from habit, partly because some old doubt kept telling him it wouldn't matter even if he did. One Friday near the end of July, Robert came out earlier than usual, unable to sleep himself, and found the gate to the unused field standing open, a coil of loose wire left in the grass, no one in sight. He stood there a moment working out what he was looking at, then noticed cattle grazing calmly on ground that hadn't held any in weeks, and Walter's truck missing from its usual spot by the barn. He almost called out. Instead, for reasons he couldn't have explained even to himself, he latched the gate quietly and walked back toward the house without mentioning it to anyone, filing the sight away next to a small, growing pile of things about his brother he had somehow stopped asking questions about. Robert, meanwhile, spent more nights than he let on at the kitchen table after Walter had gone up to bed, feed invoices spread flat under the lamp, the numbers refusing to move the way he needed them to no matter how many times he added them. The spring loan papers from the bank sat unopened in the drawer under the phone, a drawer he'd stopped opening in front of anyone, including himself. He stopped mentioning the expansion out loud at dinner. He stopped, most nights, mentioning much of anything, answering Walter's few questions about the herd in short sentences, and looking, more and more, like a man doing arithmetic in his head, even while he ate. That same week, unable to sleep, Robert went looking for something else entirely, an old shoebox of their father's papers pushed to the back of the hall closet, meaning only to check the original terms on the Northfield loan. Instead, he found a folded letter from the bank, dated the year before their father died, mentioning a missed payment and a plan to catch it up gradually rather than all at once. Their father had never once mentioned it, not at dinner, not to either of his sons, not even in the last hard months when there would have been reason enough to. Robert sat on the closet floor a long while, holding a letter that had clearly waited out a hard year in silence, and simply never became conversation, and wondered how many other things on the place had been carried the exact same way, unspoken, and how many of them he was carrying himself right now, without realizing it. He thought back, without quite meaning to the week after the funeral, when the neighbors had stopped bringing food by, and the phone calls had thinned out, and it had fallen to him, somehow, without anyone deciding it out loud, to drive into town the following Monday and sign whatever needed signing at the bank. He'd been 26. He remembered mostly the fluorescent light in the loan officer's office, and the particular quiet of the drive home afterward, and deciding, somewhere on that stretch of county road, that he would never again let the place fall far enough behind that someone else would have to find out about it after he was gone. He hadn't told Walter that either. He hadn't told anyone. He remembered, too, though he tried less often to, the morning itself, the ambulance still in the driveway when Walter had gone out to feed the herd anyway, because the herd didn't know their father had died and wasn't going to wait to be told. Robert had thought it strange at the time, even a little cold. It occurred to him now, sitting on the closet floor with the letter in his hand, that it might have been the opposite of cold, that Walter had simply understood, faster than Robert had, that some kinds of care don't stop just because the person you're doing it for is gone. Robert hadn't understood that then. He wasn't entirely sure he understood it now, except that he was starting to. One morning in early August, watching the herd cross the north pasture slower than they should have, thinner than they should have, their ribs starting to show under dull summer coats, Robert found Walter by the fence line, and for the first time in longer than either of them could have named, asked him directly what he thought they should do. Not as a formality, the way he sometimes asked things he'd already decided, because he had run out of his own answers, and, though he wouldn't have put it that way, because there was no one else left on the place he trusted enough to ask. Walter didn't answer with words. He asked Robert to come look at something instead. He brought his brother to the test field rather than explain it, the way their grandfather, judging by the notebook, had never explained anything either. Robert walked the fence line slowly, running one hand along the wire, boots pressing dark prints into grass that hadn't dried out the way the rest of the place had. It took him several minutes to notice the angle matched the crooked corner near the old boundary, the one he'd walked past without a second thought for 30-some years. He stopped walking. He looked back down the length of new fence, then toward the old corner, then back again, doing the kind of quiet math he usually reserved for fee bills. Then he saw the notebook, waiting where Walter had left it, open on the gatepost to a page filled with nothing but short, repeated lines. Move the herd today. Corners still holding. Written on, week after week, year after year, in the same unhurried hand, the line crooked in the field and perfectly steady on the page. Robert read several entries before he understood, fully, what he was actually looking at. Not a technique their grandfather had kept from the rest of them out of stubbornness or pride. A record of someone choosing, over and over, quietly, to do something no one had ever watched him do. He flipped back several pages, then forward again, watching the same short line repeat itself through years he barely remembered being alive for. One entry, from a summer he did remember, a bad one, read only, move them anyway. Another, years earlier, in handwriting still finding its shape. First season doing this alone. Corner held. He turned the pages slower after that. He thought, without meaning to, of the drawer with the loan papers sitting unopened inside it, of the letters still folded in the shoebox at the back of the hall closet, of every decision he'd made loudly that season while Walter had made his without a single word, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't fully known was tight. He didn't say much. He crouched at the fence line, touched the new grass with the back of his hand, felt the give of it, cooler than the dirt around it had any right to be in that heat. For a moment he simply stayed there, one knee in the dirt, looking at green grass in a summer that had given him almost none of it, and something that had been sitting hard at his chest since the funeral, since the bank, since every night at that kitchen table doing math that never came out right, eased just slightly, the way a knot eases when someone finally finds the right end of the rope to pull. He looked across the field toward his brother, who stood near the far post pretending to check a wire that didn't need checking, the same way Walter had pretended plenty of. Things over the years that Robert was only now starting to notice. He asked, finally, whether this meant the north expansion had been a mistake. Walter said he didn't think it meant that exactly, only that maybe it had been the wrong order, that new ground probably needed the old ground taught to it first. Robert turned that over for a while, the way he turned over a column of figures, and said, eventually, that he supposed a person could clear land in a hurry but couldn't rush a field into remembering how to rest. It wasn't quite an apology. Walter didn't ask it to be. Then, without being asked twice, Robert picked up a loose section of wire and began setting it the way the notebook showed, working it into place beside his brother without either of them saying much of anything at all. The two of them fell into the same rotation their grandfather had once kept alone, in silence broken only by wire against post, the occasional low call of cattle somewhere behind them, and the far-off sound of a bird neither one bothered to name. The crooked line was still crooked. Neither of them straightened it. For the first time, standing there together, they both understood exactly why it had never needed to be. They worked until the light started to slant low and gold across the field, longer than either of them had planned, longer than either mentioned wanting to stop. Robert asked, once, almost to himself, how long Walter had known about the notebook. Walter said a few weeks. Robert didn't ask why he hadn't said anything sooner. He seemed, standing there with dirt on his hands and sweat through his shirt, to already understand the answer well enough not to need it spoken. The notebook stayed open on the gatepost the rest of that afternoon, its pages no longer a secret worth guarding, only a record worth continuing. By the time the sun dropped low over the north field, someone had already picked up the pencil tied to its spine and added one more line beneath the last, in a hand not quite as even as the one before it, but trying. Neither brother read it out loud. In the weeks that followed, the rotation moved slowly outward from the test field, one section at a time, the two of them working it most mornings before the heat set in, rarely speaking much beyond what the fence required. The bank drawer got opened eventually. The numbers looked at together instead of alone. The letter from the shoebox tucked in beside them without either brother making much of it out loud. Nobody made a speech about any of it. The notebook stopped living behind a stack of old halters and started living on a nail by the tack room door, at a level where either brother could reach it without asking, its cover a little more worn now than it had been in June, one more season of handling added to however many had come before. The vet came back out in late August for a follow-up nobody had specifically asked for, running his hand along the same ribs he'd checked in July, and said this time, that whatever they'd done, the herd was carrying weight again faster than he'd have guessed. Robert said only that they'd changed a few things. He didn't elaborate, and the vet, used to farmers who preferred results to explanations, didn't press. By September, the whole north pasture had turned the same even green as the crooked corner, and cars slowed along the county road for reasons nobody driving past could have explained, the way people slow for a thing that simply looks right without knowing why. One neighbor stopped at the gate one evening to ask what they'd used, expecting a product name, something he could write down and buy himself. Robert thought about it a moment, then said only that they'd started listening to the fence line instead of arguing with it, which wasn't much of an answer, and the neighbor laughed like it was a joke and drove on none the wiser, and Robert didn't correct him. Walter still checked the fence line first most mornings, coffee in one hand, boots dark with dew. Some mornings now Robert walked it with him. They left it there, closed against the evening damp that first night, and walked back toward the house together, boots heavy with the day, the crooked fence behind them holding the same green corner it always had, waiting the way it always had for whoever came next. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and whether you've ever kept quietly showing up for something like Walter did, even after someone you love told you it wasn't worth the time. We read every single one. See you in the next story.